Fletcher's Gambit, a Pale Ring story. Written by Brian McKee. Based on the character by Sepia Wolf. When was the last time she had stopped to take a rest? Were it anyone else, the answer would have been a mystery. Memory tends to muddy and fade away under the waves of monotony. But for Tuki Fletcher, she remembered as clearly as if it were yesterday, although it had been nearly 2 years ago. Such was her curse, she supposed. As a krauven, a black-feathered ravenfolk, she had the advantage and the burden of carrying every memory she ever made with perfect, unfaltering clarity. In retrospect, she saw the opportunities she had had to stop and take her ease. There had been many, but not once had she taken them when they had crossed her path. It wasn't that she didn't want to, it was that she couldn't. And as her weary, road-blistered talons carried her over the next rocky ridge on the long road, she did not imagine that this occasion would be any different. A small town lay ahead of her, a squat and humble spread of low-roofed stone houses, with a single tower in the center. A cursory glance at the town indicated a population of less than 1,000. Not that Tuki was surprised. The Tranwon Gap was little more than a wide valley, straddled on either side by the foothills of the competing Barren Fell and Mayoral Mountains. The rocky terrain was not well suited to agriculture. She paused at the top of the hill to take in the town's layout, committing every turn and landmark to memory, a process that only took her a few seconds. Of particular note was the tower she had seen prior, but also a much larger mansion surrounded by high walls that stood out from the rest of the town, bold and proud, like a golden star on a bed of coals. The home of the mayor or landlord, if she were to guess. The directionless tugging in her core returned. Tuki winced in discomfort, already walking before she even had the thought to do so. With every step, her legs burned, begging her to stop and give them a break. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The pain in her muscles was preferable to the torment of an ignored yearning. As she approached, Tuki's eyes caught sight of a sign at the edge of town. "Welcome to Idonyr," it read. Tuki did not know this town, but it didn't matter. She wasn't going to be staying. The town was a remarkably dull and gray affair. The streets were quiet, but occupied, with scattered groups of men and women going about their day. Most of them were humans, but Tuki spied a handful of dwarves among them. They eyed her curiously as she walked past. It wasn't anything new to her. Krauven often received side eyes whenever they passed through. So she shrugged off their stares and carried on. She rounded a bend, coming out onto the widest street in town. The central tower loomed ahead of her, the home of a modest militia, if she were to guess. A notice board was set up near the tower, a humble array of notes pinned up to it. Many of the buildings surrounding that tower sported signs that advertised them as businesses. A candle maker, a shoemaker, a carpenter, a mason, a baker, and other essentials. Tuki's eyes stopped roaming when they landed on the bakery. She clacked her beak, and her stomach twisted in her belly, emitting a guttural growl. The telltale sound was accompanied by a dull, deep ache. She hadn't eaten in a long while. She could do worse than a few slices of bread. Allowing her beak to lead the way, she started toward the door. She came up short when she heard voices shouting on the other side, muffled and fierce.
"You're making excuses, Diana. I don't care for excuses."
The first voice, a man's, snapped. Tuki pulled her hand away from the door, her neck feathers rising in a display of agitation. A second voice answered the first, that of a woman with a thick accent.
You asked me why I'm late. I told you why I'm late. If you don't want my excuses, maybe don't bloody ask for them. Don't backtalk to me. You forget who you're speaking to. About half a man with half a beard and less than half a clue how to run a town.
Tuki's cheeks lifted in the krauven equivalent of a smile. She didn't know who this Diana was, but she seemed to be standing up to a bully, and quite well at that. The man's voice raised into an angry roar.
How dare you! Tobias, shut up. You're annoying my customers, and even worse, you're annoying me. I couldn't care less if you have the blood of a Nuna themselves pumping through your veins when you're in my shop. You're not my governor, you're my customer, and I couldn't care less how important you feel. You ain't your daddy, and if you annoy my patrons, you get the boot, so get out. I'll get your damn pay when I have the coin for it, not sooner, not later.
Diana was either extremely confident or unfathomably stupid. Maybe both. Tuki didn't have a chance to ponder which, however. She heard the man, Tobias, spluttering incoherently for a moment, then stomping feet rapidly approaching the door. Tuki took a step back, but not fast enough. The door swung open, and a short, squat man in far nicer clothes than the other people in town came surging out, his young freckled face flushed red with indignant rage and embarrassment. Tuki also spotted a fine rapier belted at his hip, and her throat tightened on instinct. The man paused momentarily when he saw her. Then he growled and kept walking. "Out of my way, outsider," he spat, his hand grabbing Tuki by the shoulder and forcefully shoving her aside. She staggered with a caw of alarm. She scrambled to catch her balance, only for her talon to catch on a loose stone on the cobbled street. The world pivoted around her, her stomach flopped in her belly, and she cursed to herself. She threw her hands out to try and catch herself, but her angle was odd, awkward. Her left wrist twisted painfully, and a sharp, searing pain made itself known. Tuki shrieked, clutching her wrist to her chest as she hit the ground, some of the contents of her pack spilling out beside her. The man who shoved her, Tobias, gave her an annoyed glare before storming off without even a word of apology. Someone came rushing out after him. A woman, Diana, presumably. She looked down at Tuki, her freckled face paling in shock. Then she spun to Tobias and threw her arms up in the air. "Are you fucking serious?" she shouted after the man. "Really? Get back here and help this woman back up." Tobias did not look back. Diana released a string of colorful expletives before turning back to Tuki. Her brown eyes softened with concern, and her face, only slightly wrinkled with the first signs of age, broke into an awkward, strained smile. "Gah. You okay, miss?" Tuki had stopped screaming, but she wasn't quite sure she could talk yet. Physical injury was nothing new to her, the road housing the dangers it did, but that didn't make a dislocated wrist any less of a problem. She sucked in a slow, deep breath to calm her nerves, steadied herself, and offered a shallow nod. "I'll be fine," she said, trying to stand. She made the mistake of putting even a little bit of weight on her injured wrist, causing her to crumple to the ground with another cry of pain. "Whoa there, let me help you," Diana said, kneeling beside Tuki to steady her. Tuki tried to fend her off, not keen on a stranger taking pity on her, but she was in no position to dissuade the baker. The moment Diana's hands found Tuki, she blinked, inhaling quietly. "Juna's jumping jugs, girl. You're skinny as a twig. And you're shaking, too." Tuki said nothing. "Well, that explains why you're hanging around outside my bakery," Diana deduced under her breath. "All right, come on now, on your feet.
I'll get you things.
Tuki allowed herself to be pulled back up, wincing only slightly when her injured wrist bumped her side. Once she was up and steady, she gave Diana a grateful nod.
Thank you,
she said quietly. Diana quirked a brow.
Oh, funky accent you got. Not from round these parts, I guess?
She asked, bending down to pick up the rolled leather-bound kit that had spilled from Tuki's pack.
Ah, who am I kidding? None of you krauven ever are. Probably from some faraway corner of who knows where, ain't you?
Tuki let off a chuckle at that, though her eyes never left the bundle of leather.
I suppose you could say that,
she admitted, her thoughts briefly wandering back to her home city. Vivid images of crowded streets bustling with featherless folk that passed her and her family by flickered through her mind's eye. She winced, her heart tugging momentarily in that direction, before she shook her head to dispel the feeling.
I just arrived in town.
Diana sighed and handed Tuki her fallen kit, thankfully without looking inside.
Well, on behalf of the rest of us, I'm sorry that your first experience here was such shite. It's okay,
Tuki tried to assure her, tucking the old, unused tools away in her pack once more.
I wasn't planning on sticking around. That's no excuse for our little lordling to be a bag of dicks,
Diana rebuked before stepping back and pushing the door open to her bakery.
Now come on, get in, out of the cold. I'll get you some warm bread, and I have someone who can look at your wrist, too. Tuki had been wanting some food. Okay, what will the bread cost me?
She asked, reaching for her distressingly light coin pouch. To her surprise, Diana waved a hand dismissively.
Nothing. This time. I don't make a habit of charity, gods know I can't afford it, but after what you just went through, I think you paid enough already.
Tuki's eyes widened.
Free?
She asked involuntarily before catching herself.
That's kind of you, but I cannot.
Diana jerked her head toward the open door.
Girl, did you perceive a question mark at the end of that sentence?
She asked with a grin.
Get your feathered keister in a chair and take the bloody gift, will ya? Well, when you put it like that.
Tuki laughed and allowed herself to relax. She could already tell that she wouldn't be able to out-argue Diana, especially not after the verbal beatdown she had heard a minute ago. And so, with no more protests left to offer, she stepped into the quiet bakery, the door swinging shut behind her. It was a simple affair inside. She entered a wide room with two tall windows in the front wall that let in shafts of the gloomy valley cloudlight. A counter ran from one wall to the other on the far side of the room, with wooden display shelves showing off various fresh-baked goods. Mostly loaves of bread, but there were a select few pastries here and there. Tuki's eyes in particular landed on a muffin with ground-up berries showing through the dough, and her stomach rumbled. Off to either side of the door, round wooden tables sat next to the windows, each one host to a handful of chairs, some of which were occupied. The faint smell of baking and something bitter tickled Tuki's nose. Diana was close at Tuki's heels, bellowing loudly at the door in the wall behind the counter.
Patrick! Grab your kid, I got a customer with a hurt wrist!
Then she turned to Tuki and poked her on the shoulder.
Find an empty table and sit down. You look about ready to keel over.
She really was, but Tuki didn't say as such. She just offered a grateful smile and took the nearest available seat. She did not let her feet remain still as she settled into the wooden backrest, however. Her talons clicked anxiously as they tapped against the floor, her thighs shifting slightly from side to side to keep the muscles warmed up and ready to go. It wouldn't do for her muscles to stiffen, thinking they were done, when she still had hours of daylight left to burn before nightfall. Diana patted her comfortingly on the shoulder, then stepped through the door behind the counter. Tuki could just hear muffled voices on the other side, one being Diana's and the other belonging to someone she did not know, presumably Patrick. The door swung open again a minute later, and a human man, maybe in his early 20s, poked his head out. His eyes, matching Diana's in hue, landed on Tuki, and he gasped in shock. "Wow, Mother wasn't kidding. You're a krauven," he said, a bit too loudly. Diana appeared in the doorway behind him. She thumped a hand into his back, sending him staggering forward. "Aye, she's a krauven. She's also a woman with an injured wrist," she scolded. Patrick yelped at Diana's tone like a scolded puppy and came barreling out. He had a small leather haversack slung over his shoulder, which he quickly pulled off and flipped open. He patted his hands down on his trousers, then offered one to Tuki for a shake. Pleased to meet you. I'm Patrick. I practice medicine. What's your name?" Tuki took his hand, grateful he hadn't tried to shake her wounded one. "I'm Tuki Fletcher," she said. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise," Patrick said before gingerly taking Tuki's injured wrist in his hands. He glanced at the other customers, 2 men and a woman. Pardon me, but would you mind stepping out, please? I'd rather not have any distractions, and there's nowhere else with room in the building." The trio of diners were not at all pleased to be shooed away, but none of them did much more than grumble under their breath in protest. Their goods were already paid for, so they took up the remnants of their snacks and left, leaving Tuki alone with Diana and Patrick. Once the door shut, Patrick turned his attention down to Tuki's wrist. "How did this happen?" he asked. Tuki winced at the contact, especially as Patrick rolled up the sleeve of her worn leather travel jacket to get a better look. The flesh was swollen and decidedly painful. She clacked her beak. "I had a bad fall," she said. "Landed awkwardly on my wrist, came down too hard." Patrick hummed in thought. How bad does it hurt?" "It's not the worst I've ever had," Tuki assured him. "But it's still bad." Patrick glanced at her for a moment, then gingerly felt the swollen flesh with the tips of his thumbs. She sucked in a hiss of air as pain raced up and down her arm, making her tense involuntarily. After a moment, Patrick relaxed. "Well, it's not as bad as it could be. It feels like a simple dislocation, nothing else broken or out of line. But then again, I've never treated a krauven before. Do you know if your skeletons are any different to a human's or a dwarf's?" Tuki shrugged helplessly. "Right, improvising it is. Patrick said before carefully aligning his hands. He started counting down from 10. Tuki, of course, already knew what he was doing and braced herself. At 6, he pushed on her wrist, and with a loud crack, the bone snapped back into alignment. She opened her beak wide and released a pained shriek, then quickly clamped it shut and forced herself into silence. Patrick felt at the flesh for a few more seconds to ensure all was well. "Right, it feels fine now," he said, "but it's going to be sore, very sore. Here, I have some things to help with that," he said before digging into his own pack. "And you said that this happened when you had a bad fall?" Diana let off an agitated groan. "That's putting it lightly." "Nah, she was shoved," she clarified as she set a loaf of bread down on the table next to Tuki. "By our illustrious leader." Patrick's eyes widened. "He didn't," he breathed. "I take it we're talking about Tobias?" Tuki asked, her scalp prickling and neck feathers flaring at the name. "He's in charge?" "For the moment, aye," Diana said, sitting down on the other chair at the table. "While his father's away." "He's a spoiled ass," Patrick grunted. "His mother doted on him like he was a prophet of the 5 while she was still with us. And his father, Idonyr, ain't much better, never punishing the man enough when he steps out of line." "A pity, too," Diana grunted, glancing out the door. "Bad parenting aside, Idonyr is a good man." Tuki hummed, then winced as Patrick began to apply a thin layer of some kind of ointment to her wound. Even to her dulled sense of smell, it was a potent aroma. She distracted herself with a bite of bread.
How so?
She asked, hoping to keep her mind from the discomfort in her arm.
Oh, he's clever as shit for one,
Diana said.
Did you ever hear about that mess with the self-titled Boulder Lord? I cannot say that I've heard of that, no,
Tuki said.
I'm not from around here, remember?
Diana nodded.
Right, short version then. He was some kind of old soldier trying to stir up trouble between Pavora and Valrive. Never got very far and got kicked out of both kingdoms for it. So he set up shop here in the Gap, had a handful of lackeys following him around and generally being a nuisance to all us honest folk. Typical bandit leader shenanigans. Then in comes Idonyr with 2 farmers, a donkey, and a pound of sugar. And with those things alone, he made the Boulder Lord look like the biggest fool for leagues, got him arrested, and spared the rest of us in the Gap from any more of his raids.
Patrick picked up the story from there.
It's a custom in Valrive that anyone who performs a suitably large service in the name of a town or a larger community be granted a minor title and some land as a reward. Idonyr got Idonyr. Yep, and he's done right by us so far.
Diana wrapped up the tale with a nod.
Now, if only his son weren't a half-formed lump of soggy pig shit.
Patrick laughed and shook his head in exasperation. He glanced up at Tuki.
Sorry about her. She's not the sort to mind her tongue no matter who she talks to.
Tuki laughed.
I noticed. But it's fine, I don't mind,
she said before her smile faded. She glanced out the window, thinking. She took another bite of her bread, then winced as she felt Patrick beginning to tie bandages around her aching wrist. Seeking another distraction, she spoke up.
So where is Idonyr? If he's such a good leader, why would he leave you all with his son? I imagine it must have been important.
Political bullshit's what? Diana grunted.
See, the Gap's contested territory. Pavora and Valrive are always arguing over who should be allowed to do things in the area. There's a lot to gain from having control of all the mines in the mountains, so naturally, both powers want the whole bloody pie to themselves. Idonyr's sitting smack dab in the middle of that. Technically, we're part of Valrive, but every couple of years, Pavora tries to buy us up. It's a whole headache. People gotta travel, meetings have to happen, and blah blah blah. Normally, Idonyr will just send a messenger,
Patrick added.
But the Pavorans are being particularly pushy this time. When he announced he was going, he told us he hoped him going in person would send a stronger message. We ain't for sale. We all figured he'd only be gone a few weeks.
Diana grumbled irritably.
But he's been gone for months.
Tuki blinked.
Do you think something happened to him?
Diana shook her head.
Nah, he's just gotten bogged down. He sent word back on occasion. I don't know which Pavoran lord's making the lunge this time, but he's exploiting every single loophole and delaying tactic in the book. So all Idonyr can do is wait and try to send us good news when he can. And that leaves you at the mercy of Tobias,
Tuki concluded with a grim nod. Then she turned to Diana and smiled at her.
Well, at least he isn't bullying you.
Diana winced, but said nothing. Patrick, on the other hand.
Mother makes him tuck his tail, but we're still bleeding coins,
he said sadly, tying off the last of the bandages.
We can smack talk him all we want, but we still have to pay his raised taxes.
Tuki's smile disappeared, and her heart shriveled in her chest.
Oh, I see. What does he want the money for?
She asked, glancing out the window again, this time toward the mansion.
No idea,
Diana grunted.
Booze, whores, fancy new sword. Kid's got a fetish for swords, I swear.
Maybe he just wants to bribe his fencing instructor to tell everyone he's the best swordsman in Valrive, Patrick said jokingly, but Tuki got the impression he was only half joking. Diana suddenly seemed to realize something, and she let off an apologetic laugh. Oh, fuck. Oh, look at us. Here you are with a broken wrist, and yet all we can do is complain about our problems. I'm sorry, girl. Tuki shook her head. No, it's fine. Again, I don't mind. It's good to have some context. If I had to have my wrist hurt, better to at least know why, no? You didn't have to have an injured wrist, Patrick said firmly. Well, no. But still, as long as I do. Patrick had to concede that point. He poured some sort of clear, strong-smelling liquid from one of his vials over Tuki's bandaged wrist. As the moisture soaked in, Tuki felt the flesh rapidly numbing. Patrick smiled in satisfaction and gave a proud nod. He handed Tuki the vial. And there we go. Baby that wrist for a few weeks and pour some of this on it every morning. It'll numb any pain and encourage blood flow to the region, promoting healing. You can use it if you have to, but light work only. Tuki took the vial with a grateful nod. Curious that a baker's boy would be so adept at the healing arts, she mused, quirking a brow. I do not wish to pry, but I am dreadfully curious. Patrick laughed awkwardly as he put away his supplies. Oh, there's not much to tell. I've never been any good in the kitchen. My passions pulled me toward healing is all. We have an apothecary in town. I'm apprenticing under him when I'm not working here. Tuki nodded one more time and pocketed the vial. Well, thank you for the help and the bread, but I should probably get a move on, she said before going to stand. Her legs had other ideas. She hadn't realized it, as engrossed in the discussion as she had become, but she had allowed herself to fully relax. And now that her body was in a resting state, her legs were in no mood to obey her commands. They gave out under her immediately, sending her toppling forward with an alarmed caw. Whoa there! Diana yelped as she and Patrick caught her before she could break something else. Shaken again? You, Tuki, need some rest. Tuki's heart seized. Rest. Her yearning flared at the mere concept, and she almost felt physically yanked toward the door, but her legs refused to cooperate. She shook her head. No, that's fine. Really, I'm okay. This is nothing new. I just need nothing new, Diana echoed in disbelief. Girl, I don't want to force anything, but I also cannot in good conscience let you go wandering off when you can barely stand. Oh, look at you. You're exhausted. It's okay. I'm fine. Really, Tuki lied. Mother's right, Patrick said, ganging up on her in a truly unfair manner. I'm no expert on krauven, but you don't look well. You've already done me a kindness with the medicine and the bread, Tuki protested. I don't want to be a burden on you, or take advantage of you. You're strangers. Diana smirked. Oh, trust me. Take advantage of my family's hospitality and it'll dry up faster than a puddle of piss in the desert. But I mean it, hun. You're in bad shape. It ain't no trouble to give you a spot to catch your breath for a night. Tuki wanted to argue further, but the words died in her throat. She could tell this was not a debate she could win, and she didn't want it to become an argument. Even if only for one night, she wasn't going to be in their lives for very long. And she'd rather not be the stubborn one who ruined a good thing. Besides, now that she had food in her belly, her physical exhaustion seemed to override everything else. With a lump in her throat, she nodded. Okay. You win, she relented. Thank you. Good, that's settled. Diana said before clapping Patrick on the back. Right, go back to the house, would you? Your dad's gonna want to know about this, and I still got a shop to run. Patrick stood upright, his back popping a couple of times on the way. I can do that. I'll see you at the house, Mother. Yep. Diana shooed him off, taking her place behind the counter. And tell hubby to cook up something nice for dinner, yeah? Loaf of bread ain't gonna cut it, I fear. You really don't have to go to such effort. Tuki tried one last time. Diana smacked her hand on the table. Girl, I am being nice. Just take it, would you? Tuki chuckled sheepishly. Right. Sorry, thank you, she muttered before allowing Patrick to help her to her feet. She leaned her weight against him, and together they walked out of the bakery. The walk to Diana and Patrick's home had been largely quiet and a somewhat awkward affair. Thankfully, the house was not far, and the silence was broken nearly instantly once the two stepped inside. Galbar, Patrick's father, had been there to greet them. He was an impressive man, that was for sure. Not in the sense that he was exceptional, but simply in the sense that Tuki doubted she could forget him even if she didn't have perfect memory. The man was tall, broad, loud, and more than a little friendly. And his beard, heavens, it was magnificent. Tuki rarely cared for facial hair, finding it a bizarre physical quirk of the mammalian races. But this one she could appreciate, if only because it was immense. She had to wonder about the amount of effort it took to groom the thing. Galbar listened intently as Patrick relayed the situation to him. He had been understandably reluctant when he first saw Tuki, a complete stranger walking into his home. But after hearing her story, what little of it Patrick knew, he warmed to her at once. He apologized profusely on behalf of the whole town before insisting that Tuki make herself at home. He pointed out a few rooms of importance, such as their guest room and a washroom she could use to bathe if she wished. And then he dragged a protesting Patrick into the house's kitchen to prepare a dinner for that night. This left Tuki largely to her own devices. With nothing else to do, she wandered the house for a few minutes, familiarizing herself with the layout. It was a humble affair, but far from the cramped environment she had grown up in. A second floor housed 3 bedrooms, while all of the other essentials were on the ground floor. It wasn't decorated much, but there was an undeniable touch of home to it. And these strangers were willing to share any of it with her. A wandering, sickly krauven. If only kindness like this existed back home, she muttered, sliding her clawed fingers along the cool gray stone of the wall. Her mind wandered back to her home, to the suspicious glares of men and women who had been raised to believe that the krauven were little more than scavengers and thieves. She recalled no small number of times she had tried to explain to others that it was not their choice to wander, but no one cared to listen. No one cared to understand. Not that she could blame them. They didn't suffer the yearning. Her feet itched to get back to the road and put this town behind her. But the legs they supported refused to take her anywhere past the front door. And she couldn't well slip out when these people were already preparing food for her, now could she? That would just be rude. And so, eventually, Tuki made her way to the guest room that had been offered. It was small, but comfortable enough. A single bed, undisturbed, hugged the wall to her right, while an empty desk and chair cuddled the opposite wall. This left a narrow corridor of space down the length of the room, toward a window that afforded a respectable view of Idonyr. She took what rest she could, though her feet rarely stopped moving. Her toes flexed involuntarily, and she had to keep her feet propped up on the bed to keep from tearing ugly gouges into the wooden panels of the floor. Time slowly ticked by, and her aching muscles began to relax. At least, as much as they reasonably could, given how much abuse they endured. Several hours ticked by, and Tuki allowed her mind to wander. As she waited and rested, she spotted something on the headrest of the bed. Curious, she rolled onto her belly to get a better look. A word had been scratched into the wood, old and faded with time. Lucia. A former occupant of this room, perhaps? A family member who didn't live here anymore? Tuki frowned, her thoughts momentarily wandering to dark places before shaking her head. Eventually, the solitude was broken when a knock came to the door. Tuki rolled over and gave an avian chirp to announce it was open, and Diana, freshly changed out of her apron, poked her head in.
Ah, there you are. Making yourself a little nest?
She asked lightly. Tuki rolled her eyes.
Just trying not to move too much.
Diana smiled, pushing the door open a little more. She hesitated a moment, her smile fading. She looked around the room, leaning against the frame.
Hey, I know this probably goes without saying, but take care of the room as long as you're using it, yeah?
Tuki nodded.
Don't worry. It'll be in good shape for Lucia when she comes back.
Diana blinked.
What? How'd you... my husband. He probably blagged about her, didn't he?
Tuki shook her head and pointed at the name.
No, but she left her name on the headboard.
Diana strode over and knelt to look at the engraving. Then she laughed in exasperation.
For the love of... She really did that? How'd I not notice? Is she another child of yours?
Tuki asked before quickly adding,
If you don't mind me asking, that is.
Diana nodded, a fond smile creeping across her lips.
Aye. My oldest. She's off in the Academy City learning to be a magi.
Tuki hummed quietly and sat up as Diana withdrew.
A good opportunity, I hope.
Diana smiled wider.
Bigger one than any family of bakers and chefs is any right to,
she said, her voice lowering considerably.
It ain't easy, though. Having us so far away from home. And if Tobias don't get reined in soon, I worry she might not have a home to come back to.
Then she shook her head and stepped back.
Ah, there I go again, rambling at you about my life. It's okay,
Tuki assured her.
I did ask this time.
Diana shrugged and turned to go.
Well, I came up here to let you know supper's ready. Hubby's made stew. Come on down whenever you're ready.
Tuki's stomach, still distressingly empty, gurgled at her emphatically. She put on a sheepish smile and rose from the bed.
I could eat a horse. Lead on.
Diana quirked a brow.
Your folk eat horses?
She asked skeptically.
I thought that was a Rythar thing.
Tuki just laughed. Dinner was a pleasant affair, one that reminded Tuki of when she was younger. Diana, Patrick, and Galbar were a talkative bunch, and Diana's sass was met in force by Galbar's own. Their back-and-forth bickering, all with good-natured smiles and plentiful laughter when one of them made a particularly scathing remark, made Tuki increasingly glad that she had decided to stick around. She felt dreadfully out of place among them. They smiled so brightly, even as a dour situation hung over their heads like a black cloud. This was how a family should be, she thought. Happy, loving, loud about it, and proud of it. "Hey, Tuki," Galbar eventually asked as they were nearing the end of their repast. "I've been meaning to ask you something if you don't mind." Tuki swallowed down a mouthful of the hearty stew, as Diana had promised, some of the best she had ever eaten, and blinked at the man.
"I suppose it depends on the question,"
she said before offering a tentative shrug.
"I'm listening."
"What exactly brought you to our little corner of the world?" Galbar asked, dabbing some broth out of his beard with a cloth. Tuki hesitated, her beak clamping shut. That was by no means an easy question to answer. She looked off to one side, frowning.
"Truth be told, I never planned on stopping here for anything more than lunch,"
she admitted.
"I was just going to pass through."
"Heading anywhere in particular?" Galbar pressed curiously. Tuki shook her head.
"No, just wherever my feet take me." "Is this that yearning thing I hear about sometimes?"
Diana questioned, leaning over the table somewhat. Tuki looked down at her reflection in the soup. Only now did she truly realize just how raggedy she appeared. The others hadn't been kidding. She looked horrible. The wear and tear she had accumulated from all her months of wandering. She idly brushed over a cut of meat into her reflection, dispelling it amid a series of shallow ripples.
"Yes. Mine's extremely severe,"
she said.
"I don't think I've stopped moving for more than a day since I became an adult."
"Oh, gods," Patrick breathed.
"Is it really that bad?" "We can't ignore it,"
Tuki assured him.
"Believe me, I would if I could."
"Is there nothing we can do?"
"No, there isn't. Until I find what my yearning's looking for, it's going to be a part of me. That's just how it is."
There was a pause. A moment of heavy quiet as it settled on everyone that they had just touched on a very sensitive topic. Galbar awkwardly cleared his throat. "Sorry, I'll stop probing," he said. Tuki offered a comforting smile.
"No, it's fine. You've all shared so much about your family with me. It's only fair I do the same." "Maybe, but you see," Diana pat Tuki on the shoulder, "we're happy to share. Or we just don't know when to shut up." Galbar held a mug of meat up to his face to hide his lips. "She said it, not me," he muttered. Diana stomped his foot under the table, making him yelp and laugh at the same time. She rolled her eyes and went on. "But we also don't got any heavy baggage we're carrying around. But it ain't proper of us as your host to go picking at your scabs." "Well, thank you for that," Tuki said softly. "You've been far too kind to me. Is there anything I can do to repay you?" Diana shook her head. "You can get a good night's sleep and eat hubby's stew," she said while nodding at Tuki's half-empty bowl. "Go on, eat up, put some meat on those hollow bones." Galbar blinked. "Wait, krauven bones are hollow?" he asked incredulously. "I thought that was a myth." Tuki held up her injured wrist. "Oh, they're hollow all right," she said with a smirk. "And very breakable." "That's stupid!" Galbar exclaimed. Tuki shrugged. "Hey, it wasn't my idea. Take it up with the gods or whoever cursed us to be like this." "Anuno, what the fuck?" "I think she was joking, hun?" Diana laughed. "I'm not." Tuki laughed. She could see why Diana fell in love with this man.
He was delightfully earnest in a sort of dopey way. A fact that was proven as the conversation turned away from Tuki and to other, more mundane matters, like a new bread recipe Diana was working on or Patrick's studies of medicine. Tuki listened to them, felt the warmth of the soup settling in her belly, and felt a different kind of glow accompany it. And she relished it for as long as she was able. Tuki couldn't sleep that night, try as she might. She lay in bed, tossing and turning and staring blankly at the ceiling, barely visible as shafts of midnight ring light spilled in through the drapes over the window. Her talons curled and uncurled, her beak occasionally clacked in frustration, and her thoughts spiraled and spun about in a maelstrom of chaos she was powerless to control. And the whole time, a specific string of thought returned to her again and again. "Just get a good night's sleep," Diana had told her, "and enjoy the soup." That was it. That was all she wanted of Tuki. That was all she had to do to repay her debt to this family and consider it even. It was such a trivial thing to ask of someone. It was kind. It was generous. It was the sort of compassion Tuki's family had dearly needed more of as she was growing up. And it was insufficient. Tuki rolled over in bed, her brow furrowing and her eyes narrowing in frustration. She wasn't normally one to get sentimental. She rarely had the chance to. She did her best to be kind to people, yes, to make their fleeting encounters positive and worthwhile. But she rarely felt a need to ask for more than was offered, or do more than was expected of her. She wasn't capable of anything beyond that. But as she turned her thoughts to the coming dawn and her inevitable departure from Idonyr, the usual anticipation of hitting the road was missing. She couldn't imagine going. Not quite yet, at least. And it wasn't that the yearning was gone either, far from it. She could never be free from that over something like this. But for this one moment, it wasn't so insistent that she get up and go. It was pointing somewhere else. It had changed what it wanted of her, and she hated it when it did that. Sighing in agitation, Tuki rose from her bed and approached the window. The clouds had cleared during dinner, leaving the silvery arch of the pale ring plain and visible for all to see. She idly traced its lazy slope for the horizon while her thoughts wandered. Diana and her family considered her debt to them repaid if she was rested, but they were wrong. The whole town was suffering, silently, visibly, but undeniably. And after the kindness they had shown her, how could she walk away and leave things in such a dire state? "But what can I do?" she asked of herself in a whisper. "Something. Anything. Inspire me. Give me an idea. Let me do something for them. Please." Her eyes followed the ring down, 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 until it passed behind the distant peaks of the mountains. Her eyes lowered still, until at last they alighted on her inspiration. The mansion she had seen when she had first arrived in town. The domain of Tobias's family. Tuki took a deep breath, her fingers itching. All at once, her yearning refocused, found direction, tangible direction, pulling her harshly and unquestionably toward the mansion. Ideas and inspiration flocked to her like a murder of crows.
Tobias has been taking more and more taxes from the people for a while now,
Tuki whispered to herself, her eyes narrowing.
but nobody's seen any benefit from it, near as I can tell. But he needs that money for something.
She turned away from the window, knelt by her bed, and retrieved her pack from underneath. Reaching in, she pulled out a bundle of leather that Diana had picked up earlier and unrolled it across her bed, revealing the array of tools she carried with her. A small file, needles of various lengths and girths, a tiny hammer, scissors, pliers, and more.
And I think it's time someone found out what,
Tuki decided. She made a quick count to ensure she had everything she needed, packed up her gear, and opened the window. She was about to jump out, but paused for a moment. She glanced around the room, wincing guiltily.
This is going to be dangerous,
she admitted to herself.
And I might not be coming back.
Deciding it would not do to vanish entirely, she took the time to extract a single feather from her tail, almost a foot long, and left it on the pillow. Then she was gone out the window, silent as a shadow, and began the journey to Tobias's mansion.